remember one time holding a door open for someone, and they were like truly too far away for me to need to hold the door open. And then, they run to catch the door because I'm holding it open. And then afterwards, I remember being like, did I do that because I wanted them to say, oh, that person's so nice. Like, look what she just did for me. Or was that me genuinely wanting to just extend a kindness to someone else, Because people pleasing is about how you're perceived by other people, and you want to be perceived in a positive light. And so it's just those little moments to kind of check yourself to get at your true intention.
Welcome to AudioLife, the podcast where we tell your story in your voice. I'm your host today, Carrie Purcell, founder and CEO at AudioLife Memoirs. And today I'm joined by Alena Papayanis, who's a writer, professor, podcaster, and social media personality based in Toronto. In Alena's late 30s, she rediscovered herself, after letting the pressures of family, religion, societal norms lead her to live what you might call an inauthentic version of her life, herself. Our conversation today will touch on much of what she's shared in her writings and on her podcast, as we aim to uncover and understand those influences and pressures, relationships, experiences, and life lessons that help to form and inform who she is today. Alena, welcome to the show. It's great to see you again.
Thank you so much, you too. And thank you for that intro. That was not only beautifully said, but so concisely put. So thank you for that. Well, you got a lot in there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, we really are going to uncover a lot. I know we will. When I prep for interviews with authors, I often have one or two books to go from, and I spend a week or two digging in. I really enjoy it. My experience getting to know you kind of before this conversation was really fun because I could dive into essays. They might reference a podcast or maybe a post or something that I could go back and listen to. I binged a little bit on your podcast, which we'll mention a few times, I'm sure, but it's Dear Queer for anybody who wants to go and check it out, and I do highly recommend it. But yeah, it was a really fun journey, just kind of getting into your world, hearing what's on your mind, hearing what you've experienced, and I will bring a lot of that forward with our listeners today.
Thanks, yeah. It's neat to have those different formats too, actually, because it is a different way of often exploring the same topic. So I can see why that would have been TikTok to video stuff is kind of funny, tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
The writing is more serious. The podcast is more conversational and casual. So
absolutely.
So thank you for exploring all those.
Yeah, I thank you for putting it out for me, for everybody listening, and we'll continue doing it. And I know we'll probably talk about this later on, but I know you also have a collected works coming out, so we can talk about what people can expect and when and where. But these conversations, we're going to take a biographical approach. We're going to take a bit of a chronological approach. We'll go wherever we go, but we really, we always like to start at the beginning. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about your early life, childhood. My first question is usually, always, and it will be today, where were you born, and is there a story behind your name?
Oh, okay. Interesting. So I was born in Toronto, and honestly, I can't even remember. I almost think I need to look it up. I think so. My name is kind of a combination of other names, which is why it's often difficult for people to know how to say it, because they'll know. So yeah, it's Alena. You said it right. Thank you for that. But people know a Helena or an Elena or an Elena, and so it's kind of unique in that sense. And my mother is first generation Canadian, but is of an Eastern European, Ukrainian, Polish background. My father was born in a small village in northern Greece up in the mountains and emigrated here when he was 13. And so and my mom was the one who ended up picking the name, but it's not a version that you'd find either in Greece or the Ukraine. So I don't know exactly how she stumbled upon it, but I think it has something to do with light. I'd have to look it up to find out more specifically. But, and actually, funnily enough, the only time I've ever seen my name quite commonly used is in the Czech Republic.
Oh.
So I think it's a common Czech name. Yeah, it reflects the embodiment of illumination and clarity, which I guess is kind of apt when you think about what I'm attempting to do with my writing, at least, is to bring some clarity and shine a light on my experiences over my lifetime thus far.
Yeah. Isn't that cool? I like that, the significance behind your name and how it's really, even without kind of consciously knowing that, it really is your mission at this point, right?
That's really interesting. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always so much in names, history, significance. Yeah, it's always part of your story, whether whether it's that conscious part or not.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool.
And it's funny how you end up following the path of it, potentially, like unknowingly, subconsciously, kind of happens to you.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah, it's kind of poetic. It's like that subconscious is very aware, perhaps. Yeah, interesting. Cool. Okay, so let's dig in. So you were born in Toronto. You told us a little bit about your parents' background. What was it like growing up? Tell us about childhood.
So this is, it's kind of been a challenge for me in a way as someone who writes memoir and essays to think about my childhood, because I don't have a lot of memories from my early life, which is something that I'm exploring. I mean, there's ways you can access it. Like, I remember the way things felt.
Yeah.
I remember the way I felt. I remember some particular kind of landmark experiences along the way. Or, for example, like, let's say I refused to go to church one day, and I remember maybe because my older sister was able to not go, and I really wanted to not go and kind of assert myself. And then my mom would go to church on her own, and the entire time I just felt guilty.
Yeah.
I felt bad, I felt guilty. And then I remember just kind of listening for her to come home and like these feelings. So I have like moments, I have snapshots from growing up. So part of what I'm doing as I'm writing is like putting it into some sort of cohesive narrative, revisiting those feelings, those narratives that I thought were true to my life, but potentially had been maybe biased by negative experiences along the way, and kind of trying to resituate it. Like, for example, recently I've been going through some old just knickknacks and letters and cards at my parents' house that I would have written to my sisters or my parents, or like stumbling upon old photos and things. And it's really kind of helped to balance some of those negative feelings I had, to like revisit or to rediscover some of the love and the care by finding that earlier version of myself again and kind of seeing her. What's also interesting about that, though, is that you often find that you're fundamentally the same person, though, too.
Yeah.
Like there were a lot of these cards that I would write to my family members were just like over the top, like, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. And me writing little punny poems to them about how much I loved them. And it's funny because that's what I write about today a lot, is love. But sorry, I feel like I got a little off topic. So growing up,
not at all. I mean, we are just exploring what was family life like. What are those early memories? And the more of these conversations I have, the more I hear people talk about kind of chapters in their lives, or maybe portions of their lives that they really don't have clear memories of for whatever reason, whatever experiences they've had. They maybe have blocked things out, or they see it differently, or so that's where we're at. That's what we're talking about so far.
Right. Yeah. So I'll give you a little more context though. So immigrant household, religious, like Orthodox Catholic, grade school and high school. I wore one of those little tunic uniforms all throughout my early and high school schooling. So quite religious. Well, I have two older sisters as well who are quite a bit older, 6 years older and 10 years older. So I was kind of like my own little generation on my own. And that was also, I think part of the challenge there, just feeling kind of like the odd person out and not really always, I think, understanding what I was experiencing. And something I'm going through now is an assessment for autism. And that has also forced me to look back at old report cards and old things about myself to see if it matches up with who I think I am or who I thought I was. And those have really been illuminating too. Being quite shy, quite an internalizer.
Yeah.
And I remember crying a lot as a kid when I was having to go do things I didn't want to do.
Yeah.
And that was obviously a challenge for my mom, who had 2 other kids to be dealing with at the same time. So that's kind of the scene for that. And the things that come along with being from a first generation or an immigrant household too, in terms of exposure to differences, different beliefs. I feel like the schooling I grew up, like it was all religious Catholic schooling too, created such a narrow, insular viewpoint and like worldview. And so that's also been something that really shaped me for so many years. And it took so much time, and I guess really that's all it is, time and maybe age, all those things, finally allowing me to break from that and to look back and see things with a more clear light and to find my more authentic self separate from that.
Yeah, there's a lot in there that's very interesting. I'm curious about, so when we think about time, because you write about this as well, so we will talk about your relationship to time, feeling like you've lost time, at least in living your authentic self and your authentic life. And you write about grief, dealing with grief about that as well. And I want to get into all of that. I think just before we do, we'll spend just a little bit more time in childhood. And I'm curious about, so I think the influences in terms of religion, in terms of Catholic school, feeling like it's really quite a small universe that's very uniform, those influences sound really clear, right? I think a lot of us can get that vision. What else was there about the time that you grew up in, which was probably very similar to the time I grew up in, but what other influences were there that impacted your childhood versus, the world that you know today?
I mean, I think the media at the time too was also very limited in terms of queer representation as well. So
yeah,
that was most definitely also an influence, because, we look to those outside representations to give us an idea of what else is an option for us and what else is out there and who else can I relate to. And at the time, like, I quite literally remember less than a handful of queer people. It was like Katie Lang, who a lot of people loved, but a lot of people also didn't love. Ellen DeGeneres, who also at the time was receiving a lot of backlash and hate and whatnot for being who she is and for coming out publicly as well. And I don't even know if I can draw on any others. And it was, so any representation that was out there was very limited and was seen very negatively.
Yeah.
And it really wasn't until university. I remember at Western, there was one professor that I knew of who was a lesbian. And I remember walking past her office once and peering in, like as though I was looking in a cage with a wild animal that I'd never seen before. Like, it was such a foreign idea to me that I was like, whoa, that's the lesbian? Like, whoa, it was such a remarkable thing that also felt so far removed from anything in my life. And so, and I mean, even just how we grew up as girls and how we're socialized as girls and as women, often through a kind of male gaze in how to objectify women or the position of women. Even if I saw people like women at a bar kissing or something, it was almost like I couldn't believe it was an authentic thing.
Yeah.
For me, it felt like a performative thing. It was for someone else.
Yeah.
It wasn't for them. It wasn't an innate interest in theirs. It wasn't their own passion, their own desire. They were doing it for the guys around them. And so that was partly the way I was socialized, but it was partly me. Like, I was equally fascinated, but also kind of disgusted by it because of my own internalized homophobia.
Yeah.
So it was such a complicated thing, and it really took so much time to see it through a different lens, to be like, oh no, I was curious about it.
Yeah.
But I was so filled with self-hate and it didn't seem like an option for me or anything that I could be. So those were kind of my early experiences that I remember.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So maybe we'll fast forward to education. So what was it like? So you went to Western. Did you kind of leave the house? What was it like going to school, getting out of that community that, that really insular, very religious environment that you'd grown up in?
Yeah, that's a good point. So first I went to BC for a little bit. I went to Simon Fraser for a few years before I transferred to Western. So in university, I found myself still in pretty straight circles and communities, which again is one of those things you look back and you're like, why couldn't some queer just have found me earlier and and taken me under their wing or drawn it out of me or like connected with me in some way that helped me find myself earlier. But it's just, it's just the way things worked out. And even though I played lots of sports, even then, they were not by no means kind of dominated, or there was no strong queer presence there. And it's funny, so I played ultimate frisbee for many years too, like quite competitively. And if anything, even though there were a few queer people on my team or on teams that I knew of, I was very much like the women on the women's team dated the guys on the guys' team. So it even ended up being a very kind of straight experience even within that sport. And again, I think truly you just have to, part of it is also you just have to be open to seeing yourself in a different way or seeing that as even an option for you. So even if someone had maybe approached me sooner or had that conversation with me or, had a connection with me, I don't know that I would have seen it that way or been open to it in that way anyways. Like it really had to, the way I've described it before in terms of like switching the lens to kind of see yourself differently, I described it as similar to when you go to a doctor's office, an eye doctor, and they're like, is it this lens or this lens? Like this one or this one? And keep going back and forth. And it felt like it really took this other lens, this other switch to be like, oh, okay, this is much more clear now. And actually those is some experiences in the past I can now see as, I wasn't just wanting to be her good friend. I actually probably had a crush on her, but just didn't know, like whatever that feeling that compelled me towards her. Yep. Now I can see it as attraction, but then I just truly could not see it in that way.
Yeah. And part of it is internalizing, homophobia. We probably will talk about your reference to self-hate. You also talked about the examples that you had. There were very, very limited models, role models, examples of other options in your life of what that could look like, feel like. There wasn't that room for self-exploration. A far from ideal environment to put any child in. It makes sense, right? It makes sense that how you responded and how you saw or didn't see things for a long time.
Absolutely. And actually I can relate it to even if you have any plants in your house. Yeah. So for example, I had this plant in my house a while ago that I kept it was just an ivy. It's like, why isn't it's not growing anymore? Like, I don't know why it's not getting bigger. It's really kind of stunted. And then it occurred to me, I just needed to put it in a bigger pot.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
That's what it is. It's like allowing for more space and more room to grow.
Yeah.
Because as you put it, like, didn't have the room for that. That's truly what it is. Like, allowing for more space to grow, to consider other things, to try out new ways, and to see that there's room beyond just what you're living in at the moment. Yeah. And that it's actually a benefit to try and allow it to expand.
Yeah, well, that's a great analogy.
And now for a word from our sponsors. Ready to share your stories and life philosophy, or capture those of a parent or grandparent? Or maybe a corporate package is right for you to build connection across your workforce and add value to your clients. Visit audiolife.io today to learn more. Our listeners will get 10% off using discount code GIFT10 and order number AudioLife Podcast. AudioLife, where memories find their voice.
And it's part of why I was curious whether, getting away to university, getting out of the house, out of your, the community you'd known your whole life, whether that did feel like this bigger pop. But it kind of sounds like it wasn't, you look back and you're like, oh, it could have been transformational. It just wasn't.
Right. And I think also part of that was I was so still kind of programmed in a certain way.
Yeah.
Like I remember for so many years, and still sometimes I struggle with, oh, what would so-and-so think about this? Or like, what would my mom think about this? What would she do? What would she say? And so even if you're physically far away, you still have this voice in your head or at the back of your head kind of trying to guide you along or push you along or warn you from certain things.
Yeah.
And so it takes a lot of like kind of deprogramming, or at least getting space from that kind of those early messaging or that early messaging that really shapes you fundamentally from an early age.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Okay, so before we move on, tell us a little bit about, BC is still pretty far to choose to go to. So you chose to go somewhere pretty far. You started in BC, you came back to Ontario, maybe you had some jobs in there. Tell us a little bit about, and you are a professor today. So you, at some point in your educational journey, maybe you found something that really spoke to you. Tell us what that was like.
So actually another place that I went to, so I went to BC, then I went to London, Ontario, and then I actually went to London, UK. That's where I did my PhD. So I was there for 5 years, also playing Frisbee, also not finding any queer community, just by nature of just, the way it was.
Yeah.
And that was, for me, travel was always an expansive thing and an opportunity to kind of practice some independence and to see new things and to kind of test yourself a little bit and sometimes maybe be a little brave or taking some risks. So It's not to say that I didn't do those things, but there's only so far you allow yourself, again, if you're kind of moving from a limited perspective. And, so I ended up studying, I did cultural studies and media studies, and then I got into cultural history. And it's funny because it's all kind of a masculine pursuit in a way, that I was studying war and masculinity and war culture. But I was very much, looking back, it was also an example of me kind of following someone else's lead. Because in university at Western, my closest supervisor or professor who became my supervisor studied war and wrote about it, and actually kind of brought me into the topic through literature from veterans, and so that's kind of what drew me in. And then again, it was kind of another example of me following the path that seemed the most natural one, in the same way that I did in other ways with the narrative of, dating, marriage, child.
Yeah.
School also was like more school, and then you teach. It kind of seemed like these are the paths, and I was following all these paths. It really takes that kind of intervention to make you see that, essentially, to say, oh, I was following the path of least resistance and the one that seemed natural and not really the most active path, not the most authentic one, not the one that I thought through deliberately in a connected way to my soul or myself or my desires, right? And so I think that's what the last few years has been exploring these other paths that feel more authentic and that feel more interesting, and really bring me back to this place of like passion and like curiosity and feel expansive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why sometimes I feel a little self-conscious about the fact that I have so many almost like titles. Like you were listing a few at the beginning. I'm like, oh my God, like it's just funny to see all these things, whereas a few years ago it would have been like professor.
Yeah.
And now we can add all these other things to the list, and that feels really good and really exciting for me.
That's awesome. I want to pull out something. In our conversation so far, you've talked a lot about following the path or the narrative that was put forward for you. You told us one memory from childhood. So in a conversation about not having a lot of memories from childhood, about refusing to go to church. So how many of those kind of vignettes are in your mind of pushing back, of, wanting to say no to some of this? And why was that one so important? Why do you remember that one?
I mean, what's funny is, who knows? Maybe that's the only time I did it. Like, I don't remember,
Yeah.
Actually, I should ask my mom about that, because funnily enough, another memory is me going to my parents' room in the middle of the night and asking my mom, I must have been like 4 or 5, asking my mom for milk in the middle of the night, and her being like, no, go, like, if you want it, you have to go get it yourself. And when I told her that years ago, she was shocked, because she was like, Elena, every night you came and asked me for milk. And every night I went and got it. That was probably the one time I didn't. And that's the time you remember. Right? Funny how skewed it is. And I remember when she said that, probably the reason I remember it is because I remember my response to that and being like, could I go get it myself? Like, would I do that? How would I do that? It's dark downstairs. And I remember kind of projecting to be like, how would I do that? Am I capable of this? And so that's probably why it's new to me. And it's funny, I think we end up connecting, or we end up remembering all these things that were negative. I think it's even just built into us physiologically, because as animals, we're skewed towards finding dangers to protect ourselves and to survive.
Yeah.
And so we end up being a little kind of skewed towards those negative experiences, or things that felt momentous in some way.
Yeah.
Whereas we don't remember, maybe the everyday things that were positive.
Yeah.
And so this has also been part of the writing process for me, is trying to reconnect to not only those narratives and things that I told myself, or that I felt, or things, whether or not they were true, but also kind of resolving some of them, or finding finding the counter to that story as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I answered your question there.
I think we were just kind of picking up on a point of, your path has been so, I think you used the word the path of least resistance, right? It was what was expected, what you knew, what was modeled, right? And then we had just these few moments of maybe pushing back, or experimenting with something different. And how many of those were, though, and what did it mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that I have, trying to look back to see moments of resistance. I think part of who I was growing up, and there's still, always some part of me that's like that. It's this kind of, and I write a bit about being a people pleaser, a recovering people pleaser as well.
Yeah.
There's that tendency to defer and to not listen to yourself because someone else is louder, or because of the guilt you feel, or the shame you feel. And so if anything, I think I probably have memories of wanting to resist, but being too worried about the consequences, or maybe resisting, but then feeling kind of punished in my resistance in some way, whether it's just to feel guilt or whatever it is, but that being enough to kind of prevent you from wanting to try it again, And so that's been a part of my recovering from people pleasing, is caring less about those other people's feelings in that sense, or caring less about, not making decisions based on guilt and things like that, but making decisions that feel authentic to your needs, regardless of the outcome. I think the more you do that, the easier it becomes, but it is terrifying when you first start to do it.
Yeah, I'm curious about, I think probably a lot of people listening can relate to people pleasing. Maybe they don't even, maybe they're just, making the connection now. Maybe it's not something that they're even consciously aware that they are doing, and that it maybe is impacting both them living their authentic self, but also having authentic relationships, right? I mean, a lot of people pleasing is hiding what you truly think, feel, want, would do to connect with that other person or to avoid, I don't know. I mean, you've done a lot of thinking and writing about it, so you probably have better words than I do. But like, avoid the to fit in, of course, but just whatever punishment is going to come back from not agreeing with that person, right? To avoid that.
Yeah, what you're trying to do is like avoid the discomfort of presenting your truth to someone else.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've written about the difference between being nice and being kind.
Yes.
And this is a big one for people pleasers to try and parse apart, because nice is actually pretty fake.
Yeah.
Nice is deferring, is saying yes when you mean no, but then probably resenting it, or coming at it in a passive aggressive way, or, it's not like an honest.
Yeah.
It's not an honest. Nice isn't honest, versus kind is honest, but it might mean it's a bit uncomfortable. And the example I use for this a lot is if we were having lunch and I noticed something stuck in your teeth.
Yeah.
And if I was people pleasing and if I was nice, the nice thing to do would be, oh, well, I don't want to embarrass her. I'm not going to tell her about that thing stuck in her teeth, because if I do, she'll be uncomfortable and then I will also be uncomfortable. So let's just avoid the discomfort.
Yeah.
But that's not kind, because then you go about your whole day with something stuck in your teeth, and then you come home at the end of the day and you see this and you say, oh my God, she let me walk around all day with this in my teeth. How many people saw me? I'm so embarrassed. Versus the kind thing would be to say, not a big deal, you got something stuck in your teeth, let you fix it. You might be like briefly uncomfortable, and I just have to sit through that, and then you're done and you're fine. And what that also does is that shows that I'm actually trustworthy. Mm-hmm. And you can trust what I'm going to tell you. You can trust my yes. You can trust my no. Versus the nice person, when you say yes, you don't actually always believe their yes, because you know that they're not always telling you the truth.
Yeah.
Sometimes we sense this in other people when they say yes and you're like, are you sure?
Yeah.
And, and that's because maybe you're not convinced that they mean it, or maybe because you have tendencies towards saying yes when you really mean no. So that's also something that takes practice, is like sitting in that discomfort of being honest. And it's like one of those short-term pain for the long-term gain. It's something that ultimately breeds a better relationship. Like you said, when you're people pleasing, it's not an authentic connection there. You're not being truly who you are.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. So how do you overcome, you talked about it can be uncomfortable. It probably, I'm projecting on you, but I imagine it takes quite a bit of energy, right? It takes that energy to consciously put yourself in an uncomfortable position. So how do you overcome people pleasing? How do you notice the moments when you're doing it? How do you coach yourself? And you use the word practice, but how do you do it?
I mean, first for me, it was really, I almost treated myself like a science experiment that I was observing.
Yeah.
There were things that I would do. Like I remember one time holding a door open for someone, and they were like truly too far away for me to need to hold the door open. And then, they run to catch the door because I'm holding it open. And then afterwards, I remember being like, did I do that because I wanted them to say, oh, that person's so nice. Mm-hmm. Like, look what she just did for me. Or was that me genuinely wanting to just extend a kindness to someone else,
Mm-hmm.
Because people pleasing is about how you're perceived by other people, and you want to be perceived in a positive light. And so it's just those little moments to kind of check yourself to get at your true intention. Another example is when you're dating, and if you find yourself wanting to do kind of not necessarily over the top things, but things early on in dating that feel like too much for the amount of time you've been dating.
Yeah.
If you find yourself, that's the thing where you're almost trying to prove your worth. You're trying to kind of suck them into your realm by being like kind as it, or being nice as a manipulation in a way, to kind of present yourself in this really positive light. Look how great I am. Look how nice I am. I'll be this, safe place for you and everything. But it's truly, there's not enough trust been built by that point. And so if you find yourself, let's say, in dating or in relationships afterwards being like, saying things to yourself like, but I was so nice to them, but I was always there for them. How could they, not be there for me, or how could they break up for me? Then you're noticing that there was probably an imbalance, and you were really kind of over the top. You were giving too much in the hopes that it was going to have a particular outcome, which was that they would like you or they would love you, whatever, right? So it does take a lot of self-reflection.
Yeah.
And then, just practicing caring less about what other people think, I guess.
Yeah. So, okay. There are lots of places I want to go, but let's keep kind of a bit of a chronological thread going through this. So you've talked about, going to university, a few different universities, several different degrees. You've talked about sports being part of that, ultimate frisbee, also how that community, that ultimate frisbee community, took kind of a heteronormative, approach to dating each other. And if I'm not mistaken, I think in your writing you mentioned that is where you met your husband. Is that right? Am I making that up?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, in that community.
In that community.
For sure.
Okay. So tell us what dating was like, meeting your husband, deciding this was somebody to move forward in life with.
So in terms of dating, I think that was another example of kind of following the narrative and saying, okay, well, who should I find? I should find, a nice man who is a good candidate for getting married and whatnot. And looking back, I almost feel like I was walking around in a bit of a daze in a way for years, where you're just kind of going with the flow, you're doing what's expected, but you're not really awake. I guess that's maybe a better way, not in a daze, but you're kind of not awake.
Yeah.
And so I think dating for me was, I guess not as, I don't know what the word is. I guess not as, I obviously was active in some way, but not like I didn't feel fully awake in what I was doing because I wasn't fully, attuned to myself.
Yeah.
So there was a kind of numbness, I think, now looking back, like now and feeling who I feel like I am now, I can see that in myself then. And it's not even in the sense of relationships and dating, but in my life in general, I feel like, all these interests that I have now also demonstrate how I really wasn't attuned to myself before, because these are all like, a lot of them feel natural to who I am. And, I have this natural inclination to try new things and play with different media and try and write and express myself. And I really wasn't attuned to myself. And I think dating and relationships was a part of that. And not only that, but I think I just had no idea of my own like inner wounds that I was holding on to and that I was not healing from. At the time, I was just living them. I was living through them. That also got played on in relationships, like fear of abandonment or people pleasing. And so in that sense, dating and relationships also wasn't a very attuned or awake experience for me, because it was kind of a very automatic, I was just kind of on automatic in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Did you feel like, you've talked a few times about kind of, it's almost like your mother's voice. Like, did you have a voice saying, this is who you should be looking for? This is what, and again, I don't want to project on you, but I had, like, my father was actually explicit. This is what they should do for education. He was explicit about race. Just things that were his experience and not mine, but I had that voice in my mind. This is what I'm supposed to be looking for. This is what will be accepted. This is what won't. So how much of that was like you were kind of on autopilot? Where did you get the plan, the vision, the route? Right.
I think definitely family, because it was a very heteronormative household. It wouldn't be probably unusual for me to come home from university and someone to ask, are there any special guys in my life? Right. So right off the bat, by asking, about men, it's a very heteronormative thing. And so that was not only kind of generalized in the family. I don't think it was ever, it wasn't, I guess maybe it was explicit in some ways, but it was more cumulative effect.
Yeah.
the messaging between kind of family and just like culture and school and the culture of that and the religion, which was very heteronormative as well. And if anything, kind of, homophobic. And then the media too, as girls were very much socialized in particular ways to be looking for this particular vision of a man. And so I think it was very much a cumulative effect of all of these things creating a particular idea of what I should be doing and what I should be looking for.
Yeah. Stay tuned for part 2 of my conversation with Alena Papayanis, where we talk about her coming out journey, we talk about community support, and we talk about the incredibly important role of motherhood in her life.
If you like what you heard today, consider recording your own AudioLife private podcast or giving one to a loved one for a unique and memorable gift. Today, AudioLife listeners will receive 10% off using discount code GIFT10 and order number AudioLife Podcast. Also, remember to rate our show and subscribe so you'll never miss an episode.